Welcome back to History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. In this third lecture, we are going to be discussing chronography. Now, we'll be taking a step back to view the big picture of the history of the ancient Near East. And as such, I'll be giving you a broad overview of the history of the region before we step into the specifics of social time. Thus, the final section to be examined under geographical time involves resources, and is that of the Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age separations, commonly referred to as the Three-Age System. This system was first published in 1836 by Christian Jurgensen Thomsen of the Copenhagen Lund Academics, and has been used with variations ever since, though not in every region of the world. All right, well, each of these ages has been divided into their respective subcategories, which are divided further still. The Stone Age is divided into the Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, and finally the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age. Now, the Bronze Age is divided into early, middle, and late. For example, Middle Bronze Age. And each of these are then subdivided by giving them a number. For example, Early Bronze Age 3. Of note, in the Levant, Middle Bronze Age 1 is not typically used any longer. There were lots of discussions about it way back when, and the great majority of scholars have decided to merge Middle Bronze 1 into the Early Bronze Age, thus creating Early Bronze Age 4. And finally, the Iron Age in the Levant is divided into Iron Age 1, 2, and 3, rather than early, middle, and late. Iron 3 is sometimes not used, instead moving directly into the historical periods of the Babylonian and Persian empires. Since numbers are used in place of early, middle, and late, the third category uses letters. For example, Iron 2b. As is evident by the inconsistency in the nomenclatures of the subdivisions, much of this system is still highly debated. Many scholars opting for, at a minimum, differing date ranges, but also different terminology. Additionally, it should be pointed out that although this system is used all over the world, the age of one region may or may not correspond to the others. For example, when the Levant was beginning its Iron Age, Italy was only just beginning its Late Bronze Age. Now, it should also be pointed out that although the types of resources used are within the names of these ages, the use of these resources does not necessarily correspond to the starting point of each. So iron was used in Mesopotamia and Egypt quite a while before the Iron Age began, though merely in small quantities. Also, bronze was not consistently utilized in the Levant until well into the Bronze Age. Finally, the question of Near Eastern dating is problematic, as much of the dates are relative to other dates. Very few absolute dates have been determined in the ancient Near East. For example, the recording of a solar eclipse that has been mathematically calculated to have occurred on June 15th, 763 BC. From that absolute date, relative dating techniques are then utilized both forward and backward to determine points on the timeline when events most likely occurred. Unfortunately, sometimes even these absolute dates are not absolute. In AD 1912, a scholar believed that he had found astronomical records of both the appearance and disappearance of Venus in the night sky, an event that mathematically fits multiple points in the Assyrian chronology. Because these multiple possibilities exist, Assyrian dates now fall into three potentialities, referred to as the long, middle, and short chronologies. But these are still highly debated. Most texts today simply refer to dates given in the middle chronology and just avoid the debate altogether. Okay, and now it's time for the overview. Although the Stone Age begins with the Paleolithic with a scientific date of about 1.4 million years ago, for the purpose of this study, the starting point is that of the Neolithic, very often associated with the move from hunting and gathering to that of farming. Although not sudden, this radical change in subsistence patterns is sometimes referred to as the Neolithic Revolution, as it begins several innovative phases in history. In the Near East, the Neolithic is broken down into pre-pottery and pottery Neolithic, with a scientific date for pre-pottery Neolithic A at around 8000 BC. Pre-pottery Neolithic B in the southern Levant, often associated with Jericho, has a date of around 7000 BC. In Upper Mesopotamia, this begins a transitional period into an initial pottery Neolithic. In the northern Levant, this is simply called Early Pottery Neolithic, and in Anatolia, simply Pottery Neolithic. With the rise of agriculture came other advancements, including the need to be near one's crops and herds in order to protect them. Thus, in the Neolithic is seen the development of households, base camps, and villages. Additionally, uses for the agricultural resources led to the development of textiles, often from wool and linen. A third advancement also began in the Neolithic, one that allowed for the preservation of these agricultural resources, which, as the nomenclature of these periods describes, is the beginnings of pottery. Between the Neolithic and the Early Bronze Age is the Chalcolithic, also known as the Copper Age or Neolithic. It's here that urban settlements develop further, one scholar even calling these settlements the first cities. The Chalcolithic shifts from the Halaf culture of the Neolithic to the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia and the Levant, one of the many small cultures developing in the Neolithic Chalcolithic period. And the Chalcolithic eventually gives way to the Bronze Age. The Bronze Age extends from around 3300 BC to approximately 1200 BC, and as noted before, is split into three periods, early, middle, and late. The Early Bronze Age is split into Early Bronze 1 through 4, EB1, EB2, EB3, and EB4, though this last period has been highly controversial. As noted just previously, the following period, Middle Bronze, is also cut into chunks, but now everything gets confusing. Middle Bronze is divided into Middle Bronze 2, A through C. Middle Bronze 1, now being obsolete, as that period has been merged into the Early Bronze Age in the form of EB4. The history of Palestine is that of growth, collapse, and growth, ups and downs and ups again. The Early Bronze Age is a perfect example of the up aspect followed by the down at the end. This rise and fall of social complexity in Palestine is seen at the very beginning of the Early Bronze Age. Change from one culture in the Chalcolithic to a completely different culture in EB1, though the Levant is still a very poor place filled with small, unwalled villages and many farmsteads. EB2 brought a small bit of change as the villages became walled, a move toward urbanism, though there were still farmsteads. EB3 stood as a time of richness. Very few but large walled cities could be found, along with a few farmsteads, the people having gathered together for both ease of life and protection. At this point in the Bronze Age, the Levant is bubbling over with life. There's some destructive behavior, but these are most likely internal conflicts rather than outside invaders. Now, note, this is not the time of the biblical patriarchs. Instead, this is the Levant before Abraham. Unfortunately, EB4 brings a collapse. The large walled cities are no longer in use. In their place, many small, unwalled villages appear, and once again, many farmsteads. EB4 was a time not of richness, but of poverty. It's here that Abraham enters Canaan. Middle Bronze 2A, remember Middle Bronze 1 is EB4, is a time of cosmopolitan revival. The decline of EB4 enters MB2A with expansion. There are now over 400 sites in Canaan. Many walled cities are found, but they fight against one another. About 65% of the inhabitants of Canaan now, once again, live in walled cities. This revival coincides with the Semitic Amorite dynasties in the east, and the second half of the revival in the Middle Bronze II coincides with the Hyksos in Egypt, these two great empires, both having Semitic roots. During Middle Bronze 2A, Canaan distinguishes itself in material culture from EB4 in its settlement patterns, urbanization, architecture, metallurgy, pottery, and even burial customs. There appears to have been a wave of northern coastal settlements that extended to other northern valleys, including large fortified cities, forts, and rural sedentary settlements. Concerning pottery, the new fast wheel brought new shapes. Characteristic are the globular jars and jugs, carinated thin bowls, flat large bowls, pyriform juglets, and large dipper juglets. Red burnished ware appears on many of the small vessels. In metals, bronze now, only now, in Middle Bronze Age, replaced copper. And the Middle Bronze 2 B through C developed from the MB2A types. The duckbill axe disappeared, and a smaller and narrower chisel-shaped axe prevailed. Daggers had multi-ridged blade, and spearheads were elongated. Evidence for an immigration from the north is seen in the absence of any gradual changes between EB4 and MB2A. As cultures collide, concepts spread and eventually became what we now call the MB2 societies. MB2 B through C developed miniature artifacts of figurines, jewelry, and more are found. And the few written documents are in cuneiform Akkadian. The Late Bronze Age in Canaan existed in the shadow of Egyptian domination. Population and density of settlement declined. The fringe areas were left, and some important sites are now left empty. Just as the greatness of EB3 met the demise of EB4, so the greatness of MB2B through C met the demise of the Late Bronze Age. City against city, and outside Habiru brought destruction throughout the land. The Late Bronze Age, like EB4, contained a lack of fortifications. At most sites, none have been found, though some continued in use from Middle Bronze defenses. Hatzor is one of those sites, with a Middle Bronze wall being continually rebuilt through the Late Bronze Age. Town planning of Canaanite cities is almost unknown, as only limited areas have been excavated. At Hatzor and Megiddo, Middle Bronze plans continued. The Megiddo Palace shows a gradual development, and several large buildings are defined. Late Bronze temples provide data on some aspects of Canaanite religion. Some were erected during the previous age, and although some underwent severe changes, others basically remained the same. International trade was an important part of the Late Bronze Age, including Cypriot, Mycenaean, Syrian, and Egyptian pottery. And this extended from the Middle Bronze Age, as there is no distinct break in material culture between the two periods. Pottery included bichrome ware, Cypriot ware, Mycenaean ware, and so forth, and Cyprus was the main source of copper during this period. Just as EB4 was the end of the greatness of times before, so the Late Bronze Age was the end of the greatness of times gone by. But this was not limited to Canaan. The known world itself seems to have been turned upside down by the time of the Great Migration that introduced the Iron Age. In the southern Levant, the dawn of the Iron Age ended the city-state period of multi-ethnic Canaanite culture and introduced the ethno-political regional structure of the Israelites, Sea Peoples, and the remaining indigenous Canaanites. Across the Jordan, there were Israelites, Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, and Arameans. With the founding of the different Philistine cities along the coastal plains comes Philistine bichrome pottery, which was developed from the locally produced Mycenaean 3C1B ware, which also borrowed from local Canaanite traditions, mainly in the use of red and black ink. Now, this has been a lot of information over a short period of time, but I hope you understand that this is just a rather big and broad overview of what we will be discussing. As always, feel free to contact me with any questions or comments.